Então, boa tarde.
Good afternoon.
A todas, a todos. Nós estamos aqui
Good afternoon to everybody. We are in a virtual institute of the University of São Paulo, Advanced Studies Institute.
O nosso evento de hoje, que
The event today
analisando
is reviewing, examining the structure of, and specifically methodology, key methodology for the analysis of democracy, quality of democracy. Now, we are with Professor Stephen Brown from the University of Kent, Emeritus Professor of Kent University, and one of the greatest specialists in the Q methodology. He's a pupil of Professor Stephenson, of whom he was a colleague throughout his life, and he is going to do this presentation with us. Before that, I will quickly give the word to Professor Raquel Menegheli, coordinator of the project of FAVESP, to which this event is linked. You can also we would like to thank you for your availability throughout these days, and also today, all your energy and availability to share with us your huge knowledge about the Q methodology. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this seminar. This is a public transmission, USB and Unicamp. Professor Stephen Brown is here within the scope of the FAVESP project about quality of democracy, and Unicamp, through its Public Opinion Institute, and USB, of the Public Policies Institution. We are coordinating and working, and this is a privilege for us to have you with us throughout these 2-3 days. Although our will was to be you be physically here, but we have the privilege to have you virtually. Our Professor Stephen Brown, who, as Benissimo said, one of the greatest specialists in the subject, and helping us in our research. Our project has an approach eminently empirical, and our interest is with technicals and methods is one of the central points of our work. And the presence of our Professor Stephen in this seminar closes a cycle of knowledge of how to use this method and how to apply this method in our investigations in this project. So once again, we thank Professor Stephen to work with us in our project. Welcome everybody, and we hope to have an excellent event today. Thank you, Professor Gabriel, Raquel. For whoever is hearing us and wants to send questions for the time of this debate and discussion, in EAI or Responde all together, answer, responde, usp.br. Professor Stephen, once again, thank you, and we can start with your presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to have been with you for the past 3 days. I'm enthused by your interest in Q methodology, which is one of my favorite topics. I can talk on and on and on about it, so you will never exhaust me. So I hope in the future that you will feel perfectly at liberty to contact me either through Jose Verissimo or independently, anybody who wants to contact me in the event that I have some manuscripts in PDF form that you have interest in, that you've run across some title, or if you have questions. I'll note later on that there's some resources available, including a electronic discussion group that which is free. There's more than 1,000 people around the world, mainly North American, European, and North American participants, but also people from Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand. So it's a very diverse group. Well, let me get started if I can. It may take a little bit to get the screen going. All right. I am making this available through Jose Verissimo, so anyone who wants a copy of this PowerPoint, that will be fine to share it with anyone who wants it. But let me begin by saying the topics that I hope to cover this afternoon. I want to talk a little bit about William Stephenson, who invented Q methodology in a letter to the British Science Journal called Nature. It was just a 4-paragraph letter in which he announced what was to become Q methodology. It didn't have a name at the time. This was in 1935. At the time, he was at the University of Oxford in England. He's English, from the northeast of England. It's important to know that he received a PhD first in the field of physics, and later a second PhD, doctoral degree, in psychology with Charles Spearman. He was the last of Charles Spearman's graduate assistants at the University of London. And Spearman referred to Stephenson as the most creative statistician in contemporary psychology at the time, back in the 1930s. It's important to know, though, that he had a degree in physics, because oftentimes people, because Q methodology is quite different from the usual kind of research methods, its assumptions, the way it's carried out and so forth, that some people will remark that it's just not scientific, and not knowing that Stephenson had a PhD in physics and probably knew a little bit about science. I want to cover some of the history and principles of Q methodology, referring some of these terms will be foreign terms like concourse theory. Concourse comes from the Roman philosopher Cicero, about Q samples and P sets and how they are constructed. Q sample is the set of statements that people then Q sort. P set is the set of people who were asked to do the Q sort, and we're very careful about how we put those two things together, the statements and also the number of people. Q sorting is quite well known in psychology. In particular, a lot of people have run across the idea of Q sorting in their research methods textbooks. But that is simply the procedure that Stephenson invented to implement what was truly his interest, was in a scientific study of subjectivity. And so Q sorting is no more central to that than microscopes are to biology, or telescopes are to astronomy, or that Bunsen burners are to chemistry. These are devices invented to extend the perceptual abilities of the scientist to get closer to what it is that he or she is interested in. I want to talk a bit about correlation and factor analysis, which are intimately related, are part of the technical procedure for analyzing data from Q sorts that enable us to then to theorize about subjectivity. I want to talk about the interpretation of the results that we get, and then also some applications where Q can be applied to virtually anything, any topic whatsoever, insofar as subjectivity is involved. First, Stephenson was born in 1902, died in 1989. As I mentioned, the Q methodology, he published several articles prior to 1935, but 1935 launched Q methodology. And as I say, it didn't have a name at the time, but he very quickly pounced on the concept of Q, the letter Q. He was first at the University of Durham in the northeast of London, up in near Newcastle. And that was when he was studying physics, got his PhD in physics there, came to London to study then with Spearman, because he was told that Spearman was interested in psychophysics. And so he thought it had something to do with physics. And so he took a scholarship and went to London. In about 1935, he finished his PhD with Spearman in 1929. And then he went to Oxford and became at first the assistant director and then later the director of the Institute for Experimental Psychology, which is still there at Oxford. And they have pictures of Stevenson on the wall as one of the founders. For various reasons, he decided to leave England in about 1948. There was money available to send British and psychologists from other European countries to the United States to reconnect British psychologists with American psychologists following World War II. And so he was at the University of Chicago for a while. And the University of Chicago at the time was probably the leading department of psychology, probably in the world, certainly in the United States. There were some very famous people. You might not know the name Carl Rogers, but he was very prominent. Lewis Thurston of Thurston Scale fame was a psychometrician there representing the psychometric approach. He founded the journal Psychometrica that still exists. Stevenson was on the editorial board for a while. So that it was a very active psychology department. Then he left and went to the National Institute of Mental Health in Washington, D.C. for a few months. He was just a visiting professor at Chicago. But he didn't feel he could make enough money. He had 4 children. They were starting to go to college. And so he left the National Institute of Mental Health and was in the field of advertising for 2 or 3 years in the New York area. And because of his work in advertising, he was invited to come to the School of Journalism, which has a big advertising program in the School of Journalism. And there was an advertising agency in St. Louis, Missouri, that helped support Stevenson while he was at Missouri. And he started there in 1958, retired from 1972, but continued to live in Columbia, Missouri, where the university is, until his death in 1989. And his family continued to live there. I knew them quite well. And his last of 2 daughters died a couple of years ago. He still has 2 sons, that one of whom lives in Washington and the other one lives still in Missouri. There's much more to be said about Stevenson. There's a lot written about him, and I can provide you with references if you ever want to look into his life and his background. Stevenson, as I said, was very much involved in advertising, specifically these particular objects. In the left-hand side, the little black car, almost all of you, if not all of you in the audience, are too young to remember anything about the Studebaker Lark. It was America's first compact car, and Stevenson, with the use of Q technique, came up with the name Lark. They had this new car, this new concept of a small car. Americans love these huge, big cars, Lincolns and Cadillacs and all of that. And so the idea of a small car, they needed some kind of special name and a special kind of way of advertising this new automobile. And he, as I say, through the use of Q methodology, came up with the name Lark. Now we only have 3 types of, we have Chrysler, Chevrolet, General Motors, and Ford. Those are the 3, but there used to be quite a number of different kinds of automobiles in the United States. Studebaker went to Canada and finally, I think, went broke and quit production. Purina, I don't know whether you get the dog and cat food with the name Purina on it. They have that little checkerboard that's on the packages. Stevenson was an advertising consultant and discovered again to the use of cue technique, I suspect, that people distinguish big dogs from little dogs. So when somebody says, I own a dog, you can never tell, is that a big dog or is it a little dog? And so most of the advertisements, even today, advertisements on television for Purina dog food will almost always have a big dog and a little dog, so that the people who you're trying to advertise to will be able to identify with it, because there's a small dog, and so some people have small dogs, and there's also a large dog. Marlboro cigarettes are probably available in Brazil, maybe not, but if you see those two golden lions on the front of the Marlboro package, Stevenson put those there. He felt that the packaging needed something more regal to appeal to people with finer tastes. And so that was put on there in order to make the packaging more attractive to people who wanted something a little bit more upscale, to make the packaging look upscale. Budweiser beer is in St. Louis. That's where Budweiser is produced. He was a consultant. I remember back when I was in his classes, we would have pictures that they were thinking about putting on billboards about Budweiser beer, and we would go around and interview people and ask them what they thought of these pictures. So Budweiser benefited from that. And then down in the lower right-hand corner is the Edsel car, which was Ford's biggest mistake. They came out with this in about 1955, or excuse me, no later than that, 58, 59. It's rumored that Stevenson was the only one who stood up in the boardroom and said, this is not the time to come out with this car. American people don't want this kind of car at this time. And sure enough, Ford brought it out and lost billions of dollars on that project, and it was an absolute failure. Edsel was one of Henry Ford's sons, I think. That's why it got the name Edsel. So he was quite effective. And the bottom line is that Stevenson was a very practical man. He was very intellectually alert, could think in very high level theoretical terms, but it could also be very practical. And the fact that he would be given a lot of money to invest in various products and advertising, you have to be very careful when you spend that money, because the advertisers will get very angry if they lose money. So Stevenson was quite successful, and many of his students in the journalism school where I started off in journalism and then switched to political science, went on to be advertising consultants to a wide range of products, automobiles, farm equipment, candy bars, Christmas ornaments, all kinds of things that are sold. And his students have been involved in promoting those through advertising. Now, to get to Q methodology specifically, we can always start here, as we normally do. There is a matrix, and you will recognize this if you've ever opened up an SPSS file, that when you're entering data, the columns are traits, variables, characteristics of one kind. Like capital A will be maybe intelligence, capital letter B may be reading ability, C may be spelling ability, all kinds of objective traits about people. And the rows, lowercase a, B, C, and so forth, are the members of the sample, the persons, so that the score X, little a, large A, is the score that a person, lowercase a, got on test or trait capital A. So that all of the scores in column capital A are all alike. They all are the weights of everybody's weight, or everybody's age, or everybody's intelligence, or whatever. And so that each column, there's a uniformity of the trait that is being scored. All of these in column A may be age. All of these in column B may be your intelligence. all of these numbers in column C may be your height expressed in inches or centimeters, whatever. Now, one of the myths about Q methodology that we have gradually overcome for the most part, although there's still a lot of people who aren't aware of this, Q methodology was originally thought of as being simply the transpose of this basic data matrix. That is, if you have, variables, capital A, B, C, D, and so on and so forth, and persons, lowercase a, B, C, and D, you can turn that matrix on its side through matrix transposition, and now it would look like, just a second. Now it would look like this. That is, now the columns would be people. Previously, the first row was person, lowercase a, and now the first column is person, lowercase a. And now you could correlate the scores between person A and person B, lowercase a, lowercase b, just as you previously correlated traits. This is built into the SPSS, and I suspect in Stata and every other software package, that you can take a matrix and turn it on its side, and one of them is R methodology and the other one is Q methodology. Stephenson was absolutely opposed to that on definitional grounds, because these scores in R methodology are objective scores, like intelligence. Your intelligence score, and maybe your height is variable B, and we want to know what's the relationship between intelligence and how tall a person is, so we can run a correlation. And turning it on its side, if you were using the same matrix of data, these would still be objective scores, but now we'd be looking at the pattern of scores for person A and person B. But for Stephenson, the correlation to the data matrix for Q methodology was comprised of scores that represented subjective evaluations of some kind. They weren't objective scores. So it was not the case for Stephenson that you could take the R methodology data matrix and turn it on its side. For Stephenson, the Q matrix was comprised of a totally different set of statements of scores related to subjectivity, and the kind of scores that we get when we use Q sorts. And I'll have plenty of examples of that. So, whereas it will say in many statistics textbooks that you can just take a data matrix, transpose it, and do a Q factor analysis, and that's what Q methodology, and there are a lot of textbooks that say that. They're absolutely wrong. And Stephenson was quite emphatic about that there never was one set of scores to which both R methodology and Q methodology applied. That R methodology dealt with objective scores, Q methodology with a totally different set of scores, and they were scores that represented some kind of subjective reaction, subjective scores. Now, the concept of representativeness is very important, and we're accustomed in our methodology, in survey research, for example, to think of selecting respondents, selecting a set of respondents that are representative of a population. So you go out and randomly select people, 500 people, 1,000 people to take your survey, and we're accustomed to that. Egon Brunswick, who was an Austrian psychologist who came to the University of California, and who was very much impressed with Stephenson's work and Stephenson with his work. And Brunswick had this concept of representativeness, that representativeness not only applied to the respondent side of the situation, but also to the stimuli. That is, unless you had a representative set of respondents, which we're accustomed to do in survey and polling and that kind of thing, unless you also had a representative sampling of stimuli to which the responders responded, you did not know, you could not reach generalizations about human function. And so Brunswick made a big deal, and he has a book called representative design of experiments or something like that, and of the need to sample from the stimulus domain in the same way that we sample from the respondent domain. In addition to representativeness, we need to distinguish, as Stevenson did, and this he got from a book by James Ward called Psychological Principles. James Ward was the leading psychologist at Cambridge University back at the turn of the century. And in his book, he distinguished between psychology as a science with a self versus a science without a self. So we always distinguish when we're looking at the stimulus side of an experiment as statements of fact. For example, that in 2005, the government of De Silva was involved in a political controversy, but he was reelected in 2006 with more than 60%, 60% of the vote. That is a collection of objective facts. We can check this. Karl Popper talks about verification, and there has to be the possibility of falsification in science. We could go back and check, did that really occur in 2005 that he was involved? Was he involved in a political controversy? Was De Silva even the president at that time? Are these all true statements? Was he reelected in 2006? And was he reelected by more than 60%? If we tested all of those and looked up and verified, we'd say that's a true statement. That's an objectively true statement. But the statement that political corruption is the most serious and complex problem facing Brazil, that is a statement of opinion. Some people may say, yes, corruption is, serious. Others may say corruption is not serious. It may not be the most complex. It may not be. Some people may say it's not a complex problem. Others people say that it is a complex problem. So that we want to distinguish between statements of opinion and statements of fact. Q methodology deals with statements of opinion. We also want to, in terms of principles, clarify what is meant by an operation. In our methodology, we are very familiar with operational definitions. If we want to study authoritarianism, for example, we need to have some kind of measure of authoritarianism. So operational definitions, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, consist of having some kind of concept and then having some kind of measurable indicators of that concept. Usually there's statements of opinion that somebody who is authoritarian will agree with this statement and will agree with some other statement and will apply all kinds of devices like Cronbach's alpha and other kinds of things to the statements to make sure that we had a valid and reliable measure of this concept. In Q methodology, and not just Q methodology, but in the writings of P.W. Bridgman, who was a physicist in the 1920s. He was at Harvard, won the Nobel Prize for physics, and really was the father of the concept of operationism. Did not mean the same thing as what are called operational definitions. In fact, what he was talking about was the opposite of that, although oftentimes he will be cited as being the source of the idea of operational definition. But he was actually talking about something quite different. And B.F. Skinner, the sort of the father of modern behaviorism, also at Harvard, incidentally. For Skinner, he was wanting to first find some kind of behavioral operation. For example, he would put a pigeon into a so-called Skinner box, and there was a green key and a red key. And he would count up how many times in the course of 2 or 3 hours, let's say, that the pigeon either pecked at the red key or at the green key. And the number of times that he pecked at the red key was, that was a behavioral operation. And then he would start reinforcing the pigeon, giving it pigeon food if it would, tap on the red key, and it would start tapping on the red key more often. So he was showing that behavior was controlled by the reinforcing consequences of behavior. Pigeon behaves, it gets reinforcement, it it increases the frequency with which it pecks at the red key. So, and he called that learning. That is, if the pigeon pecks more frequently at the key because it's reinforced, he would say that the pigeon has learned that it's going to get a reinforcement if it pecks on the key. So for Skinner, there was an operation first, and typically a behavioral operation like pecking a key, to which we would then attach some concept. Stevenson saw his the same way. In fact, Stevenson brought Skinner to the University of Missouri for an honorary degree. It happened to be the time that I was getting my degree, so I got to have lunch with Skinner and Stevenson. For Skinner, you have an operation first, and you give that operation some conceptual meaning. Pigeon increases the pecking of the key, it's learning. So learning is attached to a certain kind of operation on the part of the pigeon. The cue sort is the same kind of thing. The cue sort has no meaning, just like a pigeon pecking a red key has no particular meaning. It's just what the pigeon does. And then Skinner would interfere with that by giving it pigeon food, and it would peck the key more often. So when a person does a cue sort, ranks these statements from agree to disagree, that is an operation on the part of a person. There's no right or wrong way, just like there's no right or wrong way for the pigeon to peck either the red key or the green key. It is simply a behavioral operation. And that's why Stevenson talked about factors as operant subjectivity. That is, the person has certain subjective views about whether it's about the integrity system or about democracy or whatever it might be, and they do a cue sort that represents their point of view. It's neither wrong nor right, it's simply their point of view, but we get certain factors that emerge from that, and those factors are a function of the operations of the cue sorters. We don't know how many factors we're going to get in advance. We don't know what the meaning of these factors are going to be in advance. All of it is just behavior, but it's behavior that has a certain form, and the factor analysis shows us what that form is. Now, the law of concord, the term concord, as I say, comes from Cicero, a philosopher in ancient Rome. Stevenson, concourse meant that there were statements, subjective statements, for example, about the integrity system, and that there are large numbers, which is what he means by statistical quantities, large numbers of such statements. All of them are a matter of communicability. That is, when you get people to talk about the integrity system, whether they're lawyers or judges talking about it, or politicians or members of the ordinary public and so forth, the things that they say, and you hear them on talk shows, you hear them writing letters to the editor of newspapers and so forth. These are all a matter of common communicability. So it's shared understandings. Now, they may not agree with one another, that's a different matter, but they understand what the words mean. Of course, the sophistication of the concourse among lawyers and jurists will be different than among ordinary members of the public. Working class people, for instance, may not express themselves with the kind of sophistication that others do, but within any one of those societies, whether high society or low society, they have it's a matter of common communicability. They understand one another, and that's what concourse is around any topic, whatever. So, when we talk about, for example, the coronavirus, you get statements like this, and I took these, I can't remember, from blogs but these were things that people actually said. We must leverage and advance the best possible science. The US reached 250,000 COVID deaths on November 18th in 2020. Now, I put that in red to show that when there's discussion about something like corona pandemic, there are some statements of opinion, like the first statement, and there are some statements of fact. The second statement is a statement of fact. We could verify this fact and either prove that it's a true fact or a false fact by going back and looking on the calendar and seeing whether the United States actually had 250,000 cases. Was that on November 18th or was it on some other date? And it could be proved one way or the other. So it has statements of fact, looking back at James Ward's comment, are objective and therefore do not require a self. This statement, the first statement, we must leverage and advance the best possible science, people will disagree about that. And so when that statement is uttered, it depends on somebody's self to express that point of view. So that to make a science out of subjective communicability implies the existence of a self. Whereas physics, chemistry, even statements like the US reached 250,000 COVID deaths on November 18th, these things do not require a self. So all of these other statements that are in white on this page are statements of opinion. They are self-referential because whether they are expressed or not will depend on somebody expressing it. I may agree that we must leverage and advance the best possible science. And so I might be willing to say that. But Donald Trump might disagree because he's not big on science. So he would express something else that would be his point of view. And neither one of them is right or wrong. They're points of view. Now that's not to say that I couldn't marshal a lot of evidence in support of my point of view, and he could marshal a lot of evidence in support of his point of view. But we don't have to marshal any evidence for number two here, because true statements exist independently of people's will. My weight, however much I weigh, however tall I am, these things are independent of my will. I can blow on my thumb as hard as I can. I won't get any taller because my height is independent of my will. But the statements of opinion are dependent on, they're self-referential, and they depend on my will, of my willingness to say this or to say something else. There was a Q sample that we put together some years ago for a workshop in Bangkok because they were afraid that bird flu was going to break out. And so there were public health people from China, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, I think, who gathered together. They got interested in Q methodology because the control of the avian influenza they knew was going to depend on how people behaved. That is, it wasn't just a matter of vaccines and vaccinating sick ducks or sick chickens or destroying sick ducks and sick chickens, but also depended on people who were growing the ducks. And if you take my ducks away from me, what's going to happen to my livelihood? So were governments going to be willing to subsidize people when they were taking their birds away from them to destroy them because of the fear of bird flu? So these were statements that were gathered, all of them statements of opinion. This was from the World Bank and had to do with poverty. The World Bank had had interviews, I think, with 60,000 people worldwide about what it meant to be in poverty. And these were the kind of statements that they got. Poverty is like living in jail, living under bondage, waiting to be free was something that a poor person in Jamaica said. Poverty is lack of freedom, enslaved by crushing daily burden, by depression, fear of what the future will bring. Somebody from Georgia, this wasn't the state of Georgia in the United States, but the nation state of Georgia in Asia. So all of these were statements of opinion about the nature of moved ahead, about the nature of poverty. And the World Bank was then putting all of these statements through the, the In Vivo program for qualitative research to find out what kind of themes and concepts and so forth were underlying. And I gave a lecture at the World Bank and said, what you really should be doing is applying Q methodology to see how people organize these things and not just counting them, doing some kind of nose count. we can even have concourses around what we as adults would regard as fairly trivial things. There's actually a website where, like, my 15-year-old daughter might go to post something as to whether she thinks Ariana Grande or Taylor Swift is a better singer. And these actually have come from that website. Somebody posted that Ariana is 1,000 times more talented and prettier also than Taylor Swift. And somebody else says at least Taylor Swift writes her own songs and can play instruments. Just because you have a good voice like Ariana does doesn't mean you're a singer. And so on and so forth. All of this in common communicability that any teenager would understand and would resonate with. Here was part of the concourse surrounding the discussion about Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Some judge that to be the best rock song ever. It comes out #1, I think, on some kind of survey of the best songs. And when you go to this website, you'll find all kinds of statements. Somebody said its words are nothing more than corny medievalism. Someone else says Stairway to Heaven is not just #1, it is the one, the quintessence, the very, very apex of songs, in the 20th century, 20th century. And so here was a comment down here by Jimmy Page, who was their lead guitarist. If you don't know Led Zeppelin, you should get familiar. It's really a great band. And Jimmy Page is a great guitarist. But the point being that around any topic, you will have a body of subjective communicability that is associated with it. All of it in subjective terms. There are objective things that could be said. Some objective things could be said about Jimmy Page's guitar, for instance, and about the number of notes. But that's objective. Q methodology deals with what is subjective. Here was from a study that was done in 2016, right after Donald Trump got elected in the United States. All of these people were Trump, who voted for Trump, who were part of this study. We'll get to the point later on of who do you get to do the Q sorts. And in this particular case, it was only Trump people who did the Q sorts, and all the statements were pro-Trump. One of them said, I voted for Trump to send a strong message. Our system is and has been broken, and it can't be fixed by just tweaking a little here and there. Someone else says, my vote may have been different had Bernie Sanders been the Democratic nominee instead of Hillary, and so forth. You are familiar probably with the integrity system, and these were statements from Jose and Jose. There's their manuscript. These are statements that were in their Q sample, all statements of opinion, as it should be in any Q sort. Brazil, corruption is a Brazilian cultural trait. Some people will agree with it. Some people will disagree with that. Saying Brazil is in South America, there's not going to be any argument about that. It's an objective fact. But corruption is a Brazilian cultural trait is not an objective fact. And all of these statements are part of the common communicability around this issue. And there's plenty more. So you can make up a set of Q statements, but we could go in and take out a bunch of other statements from the same universe of discourse, and we'd get the same factors. You'd get your factor 1 and factor 2. There may be other factors that exist that haven't emerged yet in a study, but those factors that you've shown in your study will pop up again, even though you have a different set of statements. This thing sometimes advances and sometimes doesn't. Now, once you've collected hundreds of statements from the concourse, how do you go about organizing them? These were statements that had come from a discussion about tensions that were growing in the Taiwan Straits. It was about probably 10, 15 years ago. There were tensions there because the president of Taiwan, the newly elected president, had been elected on the basis of his statements of independence, of Taiwan being independent from China, and that was creating some tension. The question, of course, was, is the United States going to support, militarily going to support Taiwan or not if it came to that? So these were the kinds of statements that were expressed. Now, in this particular case, when we collect all these statements, we notice that there's some statements that represented the Chinese point of view. There were some that represented the Taiwanese point of view, and some of them that were neither one nor the other. They were just miscellaneous statements. And we borrowed, in terms of symbols, some philosophical and conceptual distinctions made by Lasswell and Kaplan in their book Power and Society that was published Yale University Press in 1950, that there's a difference of demands as when you're demanding something be done, for example, about Taiwan, of symbols of identification, which side you identify with, and symbols that have to do with expectation. What do you think is going to happen? For example, do you have an expectation that there's going to be a war or that it's going to be satisfied peacefully? So here were examples of demands from the Chinese point of view and from the Taiwanese point of view. China might say constitutional revision should not touch any sensitive issue considered by Beijing as a part of the red line, such as changing the national title from the Republic of China to the Republic of Taiwan. If Taiwan would do that, China is demanding that you don't want to do that or you're going to make us mad. Taiwan might make a demand, like if China once again began making threatening gestures toward Taiwan, I would favor sending U.S. naval forces to help protect Taiwan. In terms of identification, China was promoting the one China concept, that Chinese and Taiwanese are both part of the same race. Taiwanese, those who were stressing Taiwan as independent, were stressing that they had had a different existence for hundreds of years, and that they had really become a different kind of society, a different kind of nation. There were certain expectations. From the Chinese standpoint, they were saying that this is so important to China that China might be willing to expend more in terms of blood and treasure by going to war than the U.S. would. Taiwan was saying that Beijing's threat to use military force is just an empty threat. So these represented different expectations from the Taiwanese point of view. And similarly, among the miscellaneous statements, there were statements like war is inevitable, that is neither pro-China nor pro-Taiwan. And there were statements of demand, identification, and expectation. So those became the conceptual differences that enabled us to take all of these statements about the tensions in the Taiwan Straits and start categorizing them, just like you in the integrity system, you had the Q sample structure. There were some statements that represented this concept and others. There were 3 different concepts, I think, that you had the statements. This is the way we start narrowing down the concourse to get a Q sample. Because once we had Chinese statements of demand, identification, and expectation, we could then take, let's say, 10 statements out of each one of those categories and 10 statements out of each one of the Taiwanese categories and come up with the Q sample then of maybe 40 or 50 items that had all of this theory and this conceptual framework built into it. Now here is another one, and I'll just go over these briefly because I'm realizing we're maybe getting out of time. I don't know if you're familiar, you political scientists, with the paper by Hall and Taylor toward the end of the 1990s on the new institutionalisms. But here were statements that were made about an academic department in a university. And we note, according to Hall and Taylor, that some statements will be of a historical nature, historical institutionalism. Some will be rational choice kinds of statements, and some will be sociological. And so once we take all of these statements that people made about the governance of an academic department, we have 3 different categories. Let's say we take 13 statements from each one. 13 times 3 gives us a Q sample, a structured Q sample with 39 statements, so that this statement, the college and the university context, as well as the department's own past, are features of the landscape that are pushing us along a particular path. It was a reflection of historical institutionalism. And then there's a rational choice institutionalism, that students and faculty have preferences, they calculate and behave in such a way as to maximize their preferences as a kind of rational choice. And similarly, sociological. So we had a Q sample built around this conceptual framework. Incidentally, the way people actually perform the Q sort may be completely independent of these categories when they get done, because the factor analysis will show us the functional categories, the way the minds of the participants are actually working, which may be completely independent of these a priori categories. Now, Q samples can be made of statements, of pictures, music, and there have been Q studies using all of these. Odors, there are studies of people smelling things and ranking them from pleasant to unpleasant, for instance. Colors, which colors do you find attractive to unattractive? Foods, physical materials like cloth and leather, so people can, from a tactile standpoint, what is a pleasant feel to this object compared to another object? Anything that's measurable and in terms of preference, that I find this enjoyable down to unenjoyable, can be a Q sort. Here were, for instance, some pictures that this was for a study of children, pre-kindergarten children who had come from families of divorce. And they had identified the various emotional reactions of children, from positive feelings of happiness to negative feelings of being admonished by a parent or being unhappy, and so forth, and drew a picture of each one of these so that a child could sit down and do a Q sort and could convey its feelings to the investigator, so that here were all of these different pictures representing different emotions, and so that a child of 4 years old, you can't give them a Q sort that has words in it because they don't have the vocabulary, but they can identify with different pictures. Like if this would happen to be a Q sort of a happy child, and you see all these kind of happy pictures of happiness with mother and father and so forth, and these negative feelings down toward the negative end of the Q sample, so the child could express his or her feeling. And they found that there was a difference between children who had come from divorced homes and would do the pictures differently than those that had come from happy homes. And here's a picture of a child, happens to be our daughter, about 10 years ago when she was 5 years old, doing this Q sort. This is Arlene Thorsen, who's from University of Stavanger in Norway, who had developed these pictures for study of children. She's in the College of Education at University of Stavanger. Now, P-set design has to do with the using the same structural procedures that we use to structure the Q sample as a way to structure the people who are going to do the Q sorting. This comes more from the field of experimentation. Stevenson was one of the first to show the importance of R.A. Fisher's experimental design procedures, and this was published. His Design of Experiments book was published the same year as Stevenson, in 1935, that Stevenson announced Q methodology. And this is like a three-way ANOVA. That is, if we were going to do a study of the most recent American election, we might say, well, the 2 or 3 most important variables to take into account are, let's say, gender. Well, certainly we want to take into account party identification. Is the person doing the Q sort a Democrat or a Republican, or maybe a Libertarian, which is a minor third party? or an independent, either one or the other, or somebody who's some other party, truly minor kind of party. Are they male or are they female? Because we know that gender mattered in this election. And were they old, middle, or young in age? So here we're taking into account gender, age, party identification, all cross-classified. So we will have a young male Democrat, a young male Republican, a middle-aged male Democrat, a middle-aged male Republican, an old Democrat, an old Republican, a young female, middle-aged female Democrat, Republican. So we cover all of those possibilities. We don't have to have them all equally represented, but this gives us a guide, tells us the kind of people that we want to get, because we want, in terms of Brunswick's theory of representativeness, we want to represent all of these interests, all of these possible influences that could affect the way people do the Q-sort. And we want to have representativeness on the respondent side, and we also want to have representativeness on the Q-sample side. This then is a person doing a Q-sort. The statements are being ranked from most agree on the person's right-hand side to most disagree, +5 to -5. And so here's the mind coming across all these statements, and any of these theoretical matters that have been structured into the P-set or the Q-sample play a role, or there's some kind of response, subjective responses that don't have anything to do with gender or party identification, that don't have anything to do with the structural features built into the Q-sample that represent something else. And the factor analysis is what shows that. Usually we ask people to rank the statements from agree to disagree, but we may ask them to do it in other kinds of ways. What do you think is the public's view about Donald Trump, for example, if it was a study of Trump? What do you think would be the best opinion to hold about Donald Trump? What do you think the Trump administration's view of Donald Trump is? What point of view do you think would be in the best interest of the community as a whole? There'd be all kinds of different conditions that could be posed to people. But 99% of the studies are based on opinion. What is your opinion from agree to disagree? So here's what the score sheet looks like. Each one of those squares is a statement that's put in there. Again, there's no right or wrong way of doing it. In those squares will be the statement number, so that preserves for us a record of the way the person ranked the statements, and those then become the input into the computer system. Here is an example with 27 statements, a Q-sort study. Here is the way the correlation operates, although this is built into the software, the dedicated Q methodology software programs, so that statement number 1, Q-sort A got a -2, but in Q-sort B got a +2 for a difference of 4. Squared is 16. The sum of those squares is added up at the bottom of that column, and that goes in the numerator then of the correlation. This is a particular form of the correlation coefficient that assumes that every Q-sort has the same mean and the same standard deviation, which they do if they follow the same forced distribution. So that here's with 5 Q-sorts, you would have a 5x5 correlation matrix. The correlations each showing how the 2 people are correlated, so that the correlation between person number 1 and person number 2 is 0.05. Their 2 Q-sorts were uncorrelated. Those then are these have to do with the standard errors of a correlation. And this again is built into the PQ method program and other Q methodology computer programs. Here is the outcome from the factor analysis of one study. This is on intelligent design. Because of the strength of religious sentiment in the United States, unusual in developed countries around the world, some people don't want things like evolution to be taught. they want intelligent design. The world is so complicated. There must have been some intelligent agency, God, someone, who specifically designed it this way. And so they take as their authority the Bible, and will say that the world was created 5,000 years ago, and that man and dinosaurs lived together on the earth, and all of this kind of thing. And so they want this intelligent design theory to be taught in the schools, along with evolution and other kinds of theories that have a more scientific basis to them. So in this case, this shows that there were two factors when people did the Q-sort. And here on factor 1, we have significant loadings for a geology professor and a biochemistry professor and a high school science teacher. And here is a second factor, which represents a different theory about science, that has a law professor and a clergyman and a school administrator and a high school science teacher. And when we look at the factor scores in this, this is, you can represent the factor matrix in two-dimensional Cartesian space, so that these people that are high on the factor 1, the vertical factor, are people whose Q-sorts were very similar to one another. They come out on the same factor. And those that are clustered over on the right-hand side on factor 2 are people who have a different point of view. So these can be represented graphically. And we see here that people in factor 1 were very pro-science, that they believe +4, that students deserve a quality set of science standards that will help guide their education and prepare them for future success. That evolution is a unifying theme of biology. No educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple fact. These people are giving this +4, the highest possible score. They take this as being a fact. To them, you know, it's a fact. But these are really statements of opinion, and people in factor 2 are disagreeing with those. People in factor, I'll not go into this, but these are comments from the interviews after the Q sorting to show that the factor scores for factor 1, this pro-science factor, are very much represented in the more qualitative interview statements in which people state their reasons for why they gave statements a +5 and a +4 and so forth. This is the part of it that people in qualitative research like, that we have qualitative interviews in Q methodology. Factor 2 people said that preserving intellectual freedom is our common cause. Everyone has a right to teach and learn in an environment that is open to multiple possibilities and perspectives. No individual group or political body should be able to restrict these. You shouldn't be able to restrict me and say that my religious understanding of science is something that shouldn't be included. As a matter of intellectual freedom, all points of view should be presented. They agree with. These people that are pro-science don't like the idea that you're going to be giving a religious theory of evolution, countering evolution with this religious theory. They're not in favor of that. They only give it a +1 on a +4 to -4 scale. And again, there was the qualitative interviews afterwards showed that what these people were saying in the factors was exactly what they were saying when they expressed themselves. There was a similarity between the factors and the way people were actually thinking. I've got more material than I have time to show. I wanted, because I want to leave time for discussion and so forth. I may have occasion to come back to this, but there are, Stevenson was very strong on single case studies. He thought that that's where the real science came in, where you dug into something, just like in physics. You dig into molecules and atoms and you find out that there's a whole other world down here. And that world of subatomic physics explains the Newtonian world, but the Newtonian world does not explain the subatomic world, which seems to go according to rules and laws and so forth that are quite different than what exists on the surface. So he was very much in favor of intensive single case studies. So we have three of them here, and I'll not go into these. One of them on national identity, but you'll have the PowerPoint. And if you have any questions, again, I can provide you with plenty of published examples of single case studies. This one on national identity, this was the Q sample structure here, in which a member of the Turkish National Police who was in the United States to get a PhD and then to go back to Turkey and to serve in the National Police, whose description of himself, the kind of person he would like to be, all of these were different Q sorts done by the same person using the same set of statements. What are you like? Your self-description, whoops. What kind of person would you like to be, your ideal self? What kind of person are you when you're acting most rational and so forth? When we factor analyze that, we got two factors, that there were sort of two self-descriptions that person entertained about himself. Notice, incidentally, that Erdogan, the president, was on this same factor with a person's description of himself, that he thought that Erdogan was just like himself. These Turkish National Police had been sponsored by Erdogan because Erdogan wanted a police force to counter the military in Turkey. So he had sponsored all of these people to come over, and then when they had this attempted coup, many of these people, probably including this guy here that did these Q sorts, were thrown in prison and are still in prison. And you can imagine the kind of anguish that they went through, Lexi, my daughter. Where they idealized Erdogan and then he turned on them. Must have been terrible. Then there's one on rational choice, which you might be interested in since that's still a hot topic in political science. But this shows Anthony Downes's economic theory of democracy. And he has various propositions in here, and those can all be turned into Q sorts. And what we discovered was that people do not act necessarily in the way that Anthony Downes regards as a rational way, but there are values that get involved in people's choices. And so we distinguish then between rationality on the one hand versus rationale. That political actors have a rationale for why they act a particular way. It may not be in terms of the rational choice theory that Anthony Downes and other political scientists and political economists have, but they do act in ways that to them are rational. And then there's a single case study of an authoritarian personality that shows that the factor structure here, that here was the self along with mother and father. So the way he saw himself is the way he thought his mother and his father also saw him. But his friends in college, his buddies, and his female friends saw him differently. And this showed then the effect of the peer group that the peer group has on students. For example, when they go to college, they allow some other aspects of the self to reveal themselves that they aren't allowed to show at home. So that this was very interesting. It showed that even within authoritarian personality, because this person, as well as the others that were studied in this study, were all very high on the authoritarianism scale. They were all authoritarians, but they had a non and even an anti-authoritarian tendency within them, that under these multiple conditions, you would see these alternative identities that were underneath the surface that could be revealed, that their aspirations were not always what appeared on the surface. And so there's those studies. I'll not go into this at all, but this has to do with Stevenson as a physicist saw the connection between Q methodology and quantum theory in physics. And it took somebody with a PhD in both physics and psychology to see that they were connected. And that even the point of measurement, the mathematics of factor analysis is like the mathematics of the matrix mechanics in quantum mechanics. They're the same mathematics. so that he regarded that as profound, that the mind and material reality both behaved in such a way that the same mathematics could apply to both of them. There's a large section here on the relationship between Q and qualitative research that I'll not go into because of time, and that Sandelovsky, who has been one of the person most prominent in enunciating the principles of qualitative research, he's a nurse, I think, that there are studies in the same kind of concerns in Q methodology, which is partly why that people who are qualitative researchers still seem to like Q methodology, because they see it as having the same goals, even though it uses correlation, factor analysis, and all of this quantitative stuff. But somehow it's different from the other quantitative methodologies. And so a lot of qualitative people have embraced Q methodology. And there's a lot of references there to this. And I will go through this very quickly and get out of this. So in conclusion, we have the issue of concourse theory, that there's all of this talk going on about integrity system, about Ariana Grande and Taylor Swift, about everything under the sun. There's subjective communicability. Even amongst mathematicians, there's arguments among mathematicians, and part of their arguments have to do with what these things mean. What does number mean? What does quantity mean? There are arguments among physicists. There's still arguments. Einstein never did accept quantum theory, and there are arguments even today. And you'd be able to take these arguments among physicists and show that there are different factors amongst physicists. And those factors have implications for the kind of research they do, the kind of experiments that they want to set up to prove their point of view or some other point of view, that their different perspectives have these real world consequences within the field of physics. And the same with other fields as well. That subjectivity has to do with self-reference, whereas the world of objective reality does not. I mean, gravity works the way gravity works, whether I like it or not. That is independent. There is no self-reference that is involved. Rocks don't fall to Earth because they're glad to get closer to Earth. There's nothing. There's none of those kinds of feelings in rocks or in moving bodies. That we are concerned with operancy, which is the factors that we get are functional factors. These represent real different ways of thinking about the integrity system or about Ariana Grande or whatever. That we need to have representativeness on both sides of the stimulus and response situation. Representative respondents, a representative set of things to respond to. Factor theory and quantum theory are similar to one another. We have a lot of resources. There's a Q methodology website. There's the email discussion list that anybody can join who wants to. There, and on the website, there is like a 3 or 4 hour Q methodology workshop that goes through all of this. This was back in the 1980s, I think. So I look a lot younger then than I do now. But it goes through factor analysis and all of that as a YouTube. There are computer programs, the PQ method program, PCQ, then the KinQ or the CADE. KinQ is a laptop or desktop. CADE is a laptop version of that. These are all freeware designed to take Q methodology data, and it provides statistical analysis that is just not in any of the other things like Stata, SPSS. There are journals. Operant Subjectivity, I think, is now in about its 40th volume. The journal Q Methodology and Theory is in the Korean language, although they do have an occasional article in English. The Journal of Human Subjectivity was also published by the Koreans in English. That unhappily is no longer being published. And we have our annual conferences. Last year's was in Naples. This year's last week was a virtual conference. Next year we're supposed to be in France, the following year in Florida, and in 2023 in Northern Ireland. I thank you very much for your attention and your patience. Be glad to
Professor Steven, muito obrigado pela sua apresentação.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sim. Muito obrigado pela sua apresentação.
Thank you very much for your presentation, which you did this redemption, historical redemption, with an accuracy, methodological accuracy, and full of data about the Q method. I'm increasingly fascinated with the possibilities that the Q method can bring, but mostly, if you add to other tools of research, and I imagine thinking of those several applications in the world of where opinions are increasingly present. In this aspect, we live in a world where citizens which are not part of politics, they are making statements through the networks. And we have seen how this universe of discursive universe has had an impact on the behavior of people on everyday life. In Brazil nowadays, we are having now many statements in several manifestations in several parts of the country because a black man was murdered in a supermarket, a Carrefour market, supermarket. Take all those perspectives, points of opinion, and translate them into an analysis to understand behavior of people within democracy. I think this is a powerful tool in order to understand better, much better, the democratic behavior, as we have been doing with surveys throughout time. From another point of view, as we are doing with the integrity system, to understand the aspects that take to make decisions of these actors, which is also fascinating, and how on a small scale, relatively small, we managed to show the existence of standards, patterns of behavior, that when we, to the tools of sampling, we also managed to identify in society these kind of points of view and behavioral behaviors. These tools allow us to do that significantly. I think Gabriela, that is with us, has a question to do. Hey, good afternoon, Professor Steven. Good afternoon, Raquel Meneghello, Verissimo, Fabiola, and all the team of today, all the advanced studies, and of Lux. It's a pleasure to hear you again, Professor Steven. I learned a lot throughout these 3 days, and I have a question of your lecture. José Verissimo had already the method to us with novelties, but it's the first time that we deep in the most precise elements of applicability of the method. And one of the worries in human science in general, I will more encompassing a question concerning the method, and not specifically to all research of integrity, which involves the causality, because causality is a theme, a complex subject in our analysis, social analysis, political. And as I can see, and I would like you to say if I'm right or not, when you mention the example of the pigeon, that it does not answer to incentives, but actually it is a portrait of a behavior of the pigeon, what interests to us, and take that to the human being. The Q method, makes a portrait of the behavior and attitudes according in a certain time. However, as I understood also, when because the method comes from psychology, it is also, it allows for experimentation because you can work with a very reduced number of cases. So what I would like to ask in view of that, since causality, it exists in a series of suppositions and variables concerning in time, exclusion, alternative causes. And that is very difficult in quantitative analysis, in long questionnaires, in which you already have the data. Causality is very difficult because you don't manage to control the alternative causes. But in this experimentation, this is possible. Can I say that the Q method allows to a bigger control to establish connections of cause when it is possible to apply an experiment before and then the Q method? I would like to understand if that possibility or if this relation between cause, experiment, and Q method.
Yes, that is and that is a very good question. And I think that Q methodology, given that Stevenson had this background in physics and in psychometrics, and was accustomed to thinking in cause and effect kinds of ways, that Q methodology really emerged more from the experimental sciences than field science. Although he says in that letter in 1935, where he introduced Q methodology, that it brings the laboratory into the field, that you can now do those kinds of studies looking for causal factors. Now, he would also point out, however, that in the field of quantum mechanics, that one of the things that changed most dramatically was an understanding of causality, and that some philosophers, for example, Moritz Schlick, who was the founder of the Vienna School of Logical Positivism, was the first president of that organization, to which people like Karl Popper, Wittgenstein, well, Wittgenstein didn't become a member of the Vienna School, but he did attend their meetings. There are a number of prominent positivist philosophers that came from that important group. Many of them, when they encountered in the phenomena of subatomic behavior, gave up on the idea of causality, because, like with Schrodinger's cat, I don't know if you're familiar with the things that go on in quantum theory, but the idea that the cat may be both dead and alive simultaneously, until it is observed. And it's only when the cat is observed that it becomes obvious that it's dead or alive. And it's not, and that bothered Einstein. The idea that the cat could be both alive and dead, and it just depended on whether you observed it. And in fact, Bohr, the founder of quantum theory, said that yes, that is true. It depended on observation. Well, since it depends on observation, then whether it's dead or alive depends on whether I look at it or not. So that it sort of brings the self into modern physics. Einstein did a similar kind of thing, that where you observe, whether two events occur simultaneously or not, depends on where you are when you make the measurements. And so whereas the social science is very concerned with causality, and I was brought up at a time when we were doing causal modeling and all of that kind of thing in political science. I suspect you still are. Those are concerns that arose in Newtonian science, and that's what governed physics back until the beginning of the 20th century, because quantum theory, those arguments were really played out from about 1925 to 1927, which is precisely the time that Stephenson got his PhD. Those ideas were being debated between Bohr and Einstein, primarily Bohr and Heisenberg and Einstein and Schrodinger, and there were many on both sides of that. So Bohr won that argument. Quantum theory has become conventional science. Meanwhile, the social sciences modeled themselves after what was going on in science before quantum theory. And so the way modern scientists aren't thinking so much, like physicists and quantum physicists aren't thinking so much about causality anymore. Some of them have given it up. Skinner in behaviorism was the same kind of way, because Skinner was showing that the behavior of an animal, a pigeon, a rat, or whatever, depended on what came after it behaved. Like if it pressed the red key and then afterwards you gave it some pigeon food, it would press the key more often. So in effect, the cause of the pigeon's behavior was something that came afterwards, not before. And one of the differences between classical behaviorism, like with who was that Russian with his dog, you ring a bell and it salivated, Pavlov, and Pavlov was concerned with situations in which the stimulus would come before the effect. You would ring the bell and the dog would salivate. So if you rang the bell, the dog would start slobbering, so that the cause came before the effect. In Skinner, the cause, in a way, was coming after the effect. And Skinner said, really, the idea of cause and effect have really become less important because what you have is an interrelationship of all of these. And in fact, the idea of the field, like electrical field, magnetic fields, and all of that kind of thing, emphasize the interrelationship. So it's no longer possible to distinguish cause from effect. So if we're having a discussion, for instance, part of what you would say to me is going to be dependent on what it is I say to you. And then that's going to change whatever you say is going to change what I say next to you. So it's how do we find what is the cause of what you say five minutes from now or 10 minutes from now, because you have this interacting field. And one of the things that of course, Stephenson knew all of this because Clerk Maxwell, the 19th century physicist, had developed all of these field theorems. And the idea of a field conditions is something that was one of the greatest contributions of 19th century science to the 20th century, the idea of things that are in interactive fields. But the social sciences did not accept that. so much. It wasn't that they thought about it and rejected it. It just did not come to their attention. So even now, we tend to think in terms of causes and effects, and all of this causal modeling that we do in multiple regression equations and all of this kind of thing is based on this old billiard ball idea, which was very much the way Newton thought about the universe, that has since been superseded. And so modern science, that is physics and chemistry, no longer thinks in this old way, but the social scientists still do. Now, you know, particularly, this is one of the reasons that Stevenson was so taken by the single case approach, is under multiple conditions of instruction, you get a better idea of why a person does certain kinds of things. In his one study, a psychoanalytic study of this person who is called Martra, and Stevenson's writing about this. He wrote it back in the 1950s when he was at the National Institute of Mental Health. You know, if you think that what is really going on in this neurotic, there was this neurotic person that he was being the psychologist. Stevenson, I don't know if you know the name Melanie Klein in psychoanalysis. She was a very prominent psychoanalyst back in the 1930s and 40s. And Stevenson was psychoanalyzed by Melanie Klein. And the Kleinians are, in fact, very strong in the Sao Paulo Psychoanalytic Institute. and in Brazilian psychoanalysis, I think Melanie Klein is quite strong. So you might look into that. But in his psychoanalysis, he asked this person named Martra to, you know, what does your mother think of you as a Cuso? And what does your father think of you? And how do you think of yourself? What kind of person would you like to be? And, you know, when you factor analyze that, if you see that the kind of person that you would like to be is the kind of person that your mother wants you to be like, and that comes out in the factor analysis, now you have an improved understanding of why it is he behaves in certain kinds of ways. You know, you have a deeper insight into that. And so, you know, this is a lot to try to get across it, you know, in a short period of time. But Stevenson was also worrying about those things and trying to improve the way in which we are able to ask those kinds of questions and get answers to those kinds of questions to try to get some sort of understanding as to why something has happened. But it involves a lot of things. A field approach, so that he was very taken by the works of J.R. Cantor, who was at the University of Chicago in the philosophy department back from the 1920s on until the 1980s. And his conception of a psychological event included that everything was in a psychological field. And Stevenson said that Cantor probably had more of an effect on his understanding of how human behavior operates, because it had this kind of field conception of behavior. That you have the interaction of all the, and it wasn't even a concern about trying to figure out what caused something, because, you know, everything was all interacting. And so it was not helpful to try to find a single cause. You were never going to find a single cause, because reality just didn't work in that way. And he wrote about Cantor. He's got a couple of papers comparing Cantor to Spearman. That Spearman was interested in the same kind of thing, and that was lost in psychometrics. The factor analysis, for example, was never intended to be what factor analysis is today. That isn't why Spearman invented it, to do what people are trying to use it today to do. So I don't know if that helped. That sounds very jumbled from my standpoint, but he represents a different kind of way of understanding human behavior, so it's not something that's simply answered in a very quick response to you, but it's a very important question.
Obrigado, professor Steven.
Thank you, Professor Steven.
Eu quero agradecer.
I want to thank very much.
Quase
It is almost
horas por aqui
It's
já.
almost 7 p.m. here in Brazil,
E agradecer a audiência que esteve
and
conosco,
thank the audience that has been with us,
e agradecer toda a equipe
and to
do
thank
IEA,
all the team of IEA, the Institute of Advanced Studies of the university, and say that
para esse seminário vai ficar depois na página do IEA.
that the media for this seminar will remain. I will send to you.
Eu não sei se a professora Raquel
I don't know if Professor Raquel would like to make some
último agradecimento.
last thanks to Professor Stephen. I would like to thank him once again, Professor Stephen Brown. The arguments he brought to us for a project are of essential importance. The question Gabriela did about causality in social sciences, this is the great dilemma for all theorizers in this room, for all those who work of voting, political behavior, and now the issues of populism, authoritarianism, democratic solutions, and tolerance also. The polarization, social polarization, political and social. This is one of the great things that affect us currently. How to explain, not for the environmental, sociological causes, we have so ready to discuss, but also subjectivity. This is because this is the great challenge for our investigation, our research. Now we have a base, a significant base, and we will be able to get deeper in this study, in this methodology. Professor, once again, thank you very much in the name of the project, in the name of Professor Moisés José Veríssimo and all our team for your presence here.
Well, it's been a distinct pleasure and honor to be amongst you. I've appreciated the questions. So now that I'm retired, I am sort of out of the classroom and don't get challenged as much as when I was in the classroom. And so it's nice to be amongst people who are inquisitive and want to challenge some of the things that are said. I really appreciate it. As I indicated before, I am more than happy to continue interacting on a one-to-one basis if anyone has specific questions and want to get in touch, or if you want any PDF files of articles, if you have certain titles that interest you but you can't find the articles, I may have them and would be glad to send them on and to continue the dialogue beyond this workshop. So it's been my great pleasure, and I thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish you the best for the Christmas season, and I hope we can all get beyond this pandemic, and maybe I will yet be able to come visit in Brazil. I would love to do that. All right. Thanks so much. And thank you,
Muito obrigada.
Jose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Obrigado.